This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. As we go now to the island nation of Sri Lanka, where protests are escalating amidst a growing economic crisis and gas shortage faced by some 22 million people, many forced to wait for days and nights in long lines for fuel.
When the petrol problem came up, I tried to use WhatsApp group chats to check where petrol was available, but that was not practical. First, it was 2 or 3 hours in a petrol queue. Then it was 4, 6, and up to 8 hours. About 3 weeks ago, I was in a petrol queue for 3 days.
Police fired tear gas and water cannons at hundreds of demonstrators near Sri Lanka's parliament Wednesday as they called for the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to step down. Sri Lanka's government's forced the country's schools to stay closed for another week because there's not enough gas for students and teachers to travel to school. Authorities also announced plans to cut electricity by up to 3 hours a day because Sri Lanka doesn't have enough fuel. Sri Lanka's president said Wednesday on Twitter he'd reached out to Russian President Vladimir Putin and, quote, requested an offer of credit support to import fuel. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka is also facing a dire shortage of food and medicine, and doctors are saying the country's entire health system could collapse. On Tuesday, Sri Lanka announced it'll stop printing money as inflation is expected to reach a record 60% this year. For more, we go to the Sri Lankan capital of Colombo to speak with Ahilan Kadirgamar. He is political economist and senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna in Jaffna. His recent op-ed for the Daily Mirror headlined, "When they can't govern, they must go home." Welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you start off by explaining the extent of the issue and the significance of Sri Lanka saying it's turning to Russia for support to get fuel?
Thank you for having me, Amy. The situation from week to week has been deteriorating. Over the last 6 months, Sri Lanka was going into a major downturn. But in the last 3 months, and we've had a new prime minister in power since May 11th, and even in those few months, as Sri Lanka has been preparing to go for an IMF agreement, an IMF team was in Sri Lanka for 2 weeks. The last 2 weeks, an assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury and assistant secretary of the state from the United States were here visiting. Very high officials from India were here, but no deal was made. And now Sri Lanka is in a very dire situation. Even the World Bank and the IMF expect Sri Lanka's economy to shrink by anywhere from 6 to 8%. That is negative GDP growth of, in my view, as probably over 10% this year. So it's, farmers have stopped cultivating, fishermen can't go to the sea because they don't have kerosene oil, and our entire informal sector, 60% of our economy is the informal sector, has come grinding to a halt because of fuel shortages. And the people are blaming President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe for the continued economic crisis that they are facing. And it's in that context, there is likely to be a very powerful wave of protests starting this Saturday. We saw that 2 months ago when the president's brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, resigned as prime minister. Now, day after tomorrow, there's going to be very massive protests calling for the resignation of the president and prime minister. And it's in the context of this wave that the president is also desperately asking various actors, including President Putin of Russia, to provide oil to try to pacify the masses here in Sri Lanka.
Ahilan, could you talk about how the government has so far responded to these protests, and also a piece that you wrote earlier this week headlined "When they can't govern, they must go home," in which you point out that the ideology of our ruling class, namely Sri Lanka's ruling class for decades, has been one of solving all our problems from food security to people's livelihoods by importing. Now, what does that have to do with the scale of the crisis right now, the fact that Sri Lanka was so heavily dependent on imports?
Sri Lanka was the first country in South Asia to liberalize its economy way back in 1977. This was even well before the election of President Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Sri Lanka was put on the neoliberal path with structural adjustment policies of the IMF and the World Bank. And some of the things that we did, including in agriculture, which meant that we became even dependent for food in terms of imports. A lot of produce that could have been produced here, whether it's milk foods, whether it's vegetables, all of these started to be imported. And we started an economy that was very much even more dependent on the external sector. And that was then further accelerated after the long civil war in Sri Lanka, which ended in 2009, with excessive borrowings in the international financial markets, what are called sovereign bonds. So this dependency and this idea that we can import our way out through debt has continued to this day. I would argue even now, over the last 4 months, the government thinks that the solution to all our problems is to go for an IMF solution, IMF agreement. And as if the IMF can come into Sri Lanka and completely restructure the economy and make everything fine. In other words, there is no discussion on the part of the government on how we as Sri Lankans are going to come out of this crisis, how we are going to address the great inequalities in this country. But instead, they've been implementing austerity measures over the last 3-4 months, which have made the burden on the people that much more harsher. So at the core of this is the class question in terms of who has benefited from these imports and this inflow of global finance, and who is asked to pay for it now. As the cost of living, if you take the price of bread, it has tripled over the last 6 months. But the incomes and livelihoods of working people have declined or are increasingly disrupted. And in that,
go ahead.
And in that context, as people go out on the streets and they start protesting, the police has become increasingly repressive. They are targeting protesters and arresting them. Students have been in the lead of protests, particularly university students. They've been tear-gassed. And it's to be seen what would happen on Saturday when another big wave of protests are to be launched in Sri Lanka, throughout the country, and particularly in Colombo, pressuring the president and prime minister to resign. What the military and the police would do in that context. The demand now is for both of them to resign and for an interim government to be formed to be able to stabilize the country economically and politically, and also to bring about a people's council with representatives of the people, of the protesters, of professional organizations, to be able to stabilize the country until we can have elections and move forward.
Ahilan Kadirgamar, I want to thank you for being with us, political economist, senior lecturer at University of Jaffna, usually in Jaffna, but right now in Colombo. We'll link to your piece in the Daily Mirror, When They Can't Govern, They Must Go Home. As we turn to put this in a broader context in the Global South, amidst the protests in Sri Lanka, there have also been widespread demonstrations in Ghana, in Peru, in Ecuador, and other countries over high gas prices. For more on the impact of these rising fuel prices on countries in the Global South, where the impacts have been especially severe amidst the war in Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic, we're joined by Antoine Haff. He is the former chief oil analyst at the International Energy Agency, an adjunct senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Antoine Haff, welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy.
If you can talk about Sri Lanka, the example of Sri Lanka, and how it compares to what's happening in the rest of the Global South.
Yeah, well, Sri Lanka has its own problems linked to the nature of its economy and the shortfall in tourism revenue they had to face with COVID and so on. but they're also part of a broader situation, which is the increase in energy prices over the last few months, which has perhaps accelerated since the invasion of Ukraine. Sri Lanka is entirely dependent on its oil supply on imports, as are other countries in South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, to various degrees. And it's now it has less money to pay for high cost, high priced energy. So hence a shortage. This is not a unique situation. Again, we see pressures in Pakistan. We see pressures in all the countries you've mentioned, having to fork out a lot more for their energy supplies. But it's particularly acute in Sri Lanka, partly because they're about 100% dependent on oil imports, and also because of their own underlying issues.
And Antoine, just to give a sense of the scale of the increase of these prices, international coal prices have reportedly risen 5 times since last year, while natural gas prices have gone up 10 times more than what they were last year. So if you could respond explain what you think might reduce the prices. There are those who say that it's only a global recession that would bring the prices of fuel down. And if that is not to occur, if fuel prices are not to go down, how are these countries who are so dependent on fuel and gas imports supposed to cope?
Yeah, well, it's tough. So what's very unique about this situation is that it's a complete energy crisis, as opposed to earlier major oil crisis in the 1970s, the first oil shock of 1973, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, more recent events. We're more focused on the oil market. Today we have concerns about oil, about gas, about coal, as you said. It's really across the board, but with differences depending on which fuel you look at. So in oil, there's a tightness that's been building over the last few years because we had a shortfall of investment in capacity that has started around the first price collapse of 2014. Then we had the second price collapse at the time of the first wave of COVID. That has really discouraged investment. The transition to a cleaner energy mix, the energy transition, also has discouraged a lot of investment in the upstream. So we have not had the kind of reinvestment in production capacity that you would normally have. And at the same time, demand was depressed because of COVID, but now it's coming back with a vengeance. So there's an imbalance, or there was an imbalance, and we had a very steady tightening of supply-demand balances over the last year and a big drop in global inventories throughout 2021. Ironically, since the start of the invasion of Ukraine, inventories on the global stage have started to bounce back, and they're now significantly higher than they were before February 24th. Partly because the sanctions against Russia are not really reining in Russian supplies. Supplies are not going where they used to go, Europe in particular, the US to some extent. They're going more to Asia, but they haven't been really reduced dramatically, at least not yet. But they're going elsewhere. More recently, we're seeing a little bit of a drop in inventories again, because one factor that helped rebuild inventories over the last few months was also COVID in China and the lockdown of Shanghai and other cities. As Shanghai comes out of confinement, demand rebounds a bit there. So we have a structural crisis, structural and cyclical crisis in the oil market, which is not going to be resolved anytime soon. It's not going to get worse. There's many forecasts out there saying we're going to hit $200, $300 a barrel of oil. That's not going to happen. We're not going to go so high. But we'll probably stay for an extended period between $90 and $130 a barrel, which is historically high. Now, if you turn to natural gas, it's a completely different story because gas is not at all as flexible as oil. So when gas exports from Russia to Europe go down, they cannot easily be redirected elsewhere. And Europe cannot easily replace those imports with other supplies. So there's a dramatic tightening of gas supplies, which is going to get a lot worse over the next few months, and for which there's no quick solution. But it's not affecting Sri Lanka per se directly, because Sri Lanka is not an importer of natural gas, of LNG. It was planning to. It had announced recently plans to build LNG capacity to shift some of its electricity generation from coal to gas to be cleaner. Now, those plans are called into question. It looks unlikely that this is going to happen over the next, the foreseeable future. It might be on hold, but it's not really hitting the Sri Lankan economy directly.
And Antoine, finally, if you could explain, you've just said that there is a distinction between natural gas and oil. Now, the price of oil, irrespective of where one imports from, whether it's Russia, the U.S., or Saudi Arabia, the price of oil is set on the global market. So could you explain how that impacts the ways in which countries can import oil, even as prices vary, and also whether that's true of natural gas?
Yeah, sure. Oil is a global commodity. Oil is fungible. It's easy to transport. That's why it's been so successful as a fuel. That's one of the reasons. So oil gets traded internationally, and all countries import and export oil, almost all of them. So it's really a global market with a price that's set internationally on a planet-wide market. Gas is a bit different. It's much more difficult to transport. Historically, it was transported only by pipeline. Over the last decade, we've seen a very sharp increase in the share of liquefied natural gas in the gas market. Gas that's liquefied at very low temperature and then transported in liquid form on ships, which is much more flexible, and then regasified in the consumer countries at the arrival point. But gas is still a much more fragmented market, more difficult to transport, and therefore we see more differentiated markets, an Asian market, a European market, a US, American market, with different prices. The prices have tended to converge as the share of LNG has increased, but still is differentiated. Another factor in oil, by the way, is the tightness in refining capacity. Many refineries have closed down in the last few years, and that tendency has accelerated with COVID. So we now have a world that's short of refining capacity, except for China, which has a lot of refining capacity available, is sitting on large inventories of crude, but at the moment is not really choosing to help the international market and export the products that it is not consuming at home.
Well, Anton Haff, we want to thank you for being with us, former chief oil analyst at International Energy Agency, now with the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, speaking to us from Paris, France. Next up, we go to Aziz Rana, Cornell University professor, wrote a major piece in Dissent magazine called Left Internationalism in the Heart of Empire. We'll speak with Aziz Rana and with Dara Lee, who responds. Stay with us.